The call came in at 4:47 in the morning, and I still remember looking at the clock on my nightstand like somehow the time mattered, like if it had been a more reasonable hour, the news would have been different. It was a nurse at Vancouver General. She asked if I was the father of a man named David Kowalski. I said yes. She told me my son had been admitted 3 hours earlier with severe burns covering nearly 40% of his body, his arms, his chest, part of his neck. There had been a propane fire at the cabin. A neighbor had found him and called 911. I asked her where his wife was. There was a pause on the line. A small pause, but I felt it. "We've been trying to reach her," the nurse said carefully. "We have a number on file, but there's no answer." I was already out of bed before she finished the sentence. I'm 64 years old. I live in Kelowna, British Columbia, in the same house I've owned for 26 years. I'm retired. I spent 30 years as a civil engineer, mostly infrastructure contracts across the province. I'm not a man who panics. I've managed project sites where things went wrong, where decisions had to be made fast and clean, but standing in my bedroom at 4:45 in the morning, pulling on whatever clothes I could find in the dark, I felt something I hadn't felt since my wife passed 7 years ago. A specific kind of terror that has nothing to do with you personally. The terror of watching someone you love disappear into something you can't fix with your own hands. I called my daughter-in-law's cell on the drive to the airport, straight to voicemail. I called 3 more times. Same thing. I told myself she might have had her phone on silent. I told myself a lot of things on that 2-hour drive to catch the first flight to Vancouver. David is my only son. He's 37. He works in software project management. Smart kid, always was. He met Natalie about 5 years ago at some industry event in Calgary, and she moved to Vancouver to be with him within 6 months of them starting to date. I'll be honest, I liked her at first. She was confident, well-dressed, very good at making you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room. She and David got married in the summer of 2021, outdoor ceremony at a winery in the Okanagan. 70 guests, very nice. I paid for a significant portion of it because David asked me to and because I had the money, and he was my son. I should have paid more attention to the things that bothered me instead of talking myself out of them. The cabin belonged to David. He'd bought it the year before the wedding, a small place up near Pemberton, 2 hours north of Vancouver, on a property that had been in rough shape but had good bones. He spent weekends fixing it up himself. It was his project, his retreat. Natalie came maybe twice in the first year, and then stopped going altogether. She called it rustic, which in her vocabulary meant beneath her. When I landed at YVR and got a cab to the hospital, David was in the burn unit, sedated and stable, which at that point meant alive but nowhere near out of danger. The burns on his forearms and hands were deep. There was talk of grafts, of weeks of recovery, possibly months. The attending physician, a calm woman in her 40s who did not sugarcoat anything, told me the next 72 hours would be critical. I sat beside my son's bed and held the part of his arm that wasn't wrapped in dressing, and I talked to him even though he couldn't hear me. I told him he was going to be fine. I told him I was there. And then I asked the nurse again about his wife. She hesitated the same way the first nurse had on the phone. I noticed that. "She was contacted this morning," the nurse said. "She indicated she was out of town and would make arrangements to return." Out of town? Where? I'm not certain of the details. I stepped into the hallway and called Natalie's number again. This time she picked up. There was noise in the background, not road noise or airport noise, something lighter, music maybe, and voices. The kind of ambient sound you get at a hotel pool or a restaurant patio. "Oh, Harold," she said, and her voice had that particular quality I'd started recognizing over the past couple of years, a kind of performed concern, like she was putting on a coat she didn't quite own. "I know, I heard. I'm already looking at flights." "Where are you, Natalie?" "I'm in Scottsdale. I came down for it. It was a wellness retreat, a few days thing. I had it booked for months. Scottsdale, Arizona. My son was in a burn unit in Vancouver, and she was at a spa resort in Scottsdale. I want to be careful about what I say here, because I know how I must have sounded to her in that moment. A worried father. Overreacting. She was coming back after all. She said she was already looking at flights. But I've been in enough rooms where decisions were being made to know when someone is managing you rather than talking to you. And Natalie was managing me. "When's the earliest flight you can get?" I asked. "I'll know once I check. I'll call you back." She didn't call back for 4 hours. In those 4 hours, I learned several things, not because I went looking, but because I'm a father who was sitting in a waiting room with nothing to do except think, and because my son, even sedated in a hospital bed, had left his personal laptop in his truck. And his truck was in the hospital parkade, and I had his spare key on my keychain because David had given it to me 2 years ago after the first time he locked himself out of something. I'm not going to pretend I felt entirely comfortable going through his things, but I had 72 critical hours and a daughter-in-law who was taking 4 hours to check flight availability. I sat in the parkade in my son's truck, and I opened the laptop because I needed to understand what was happening. David had been doing something I didn't expect. He'd been building a file. It was a folder on his desktop, named with a series of numbers that meant nothing on the surface. Inside were screenshots, bank statements, a series of emails, and a document he'd been writing himself, dated entries going back about 2.5 months. My son, who preferred to let things go rather than confront them, who got his conflict avoidance honestly because, Lord knows I'm not much better, had been quietly, methodically documenting what he'd discovered about his wife. I read it sitting in a concrete parkade in Vancouver at 10 in the morning with hospital coffee going cold in the cup holder. The short version is this. Natalie had been having an affair for at least 8 months, possibly longer, with a man I'll call her colleague, because that's what he was. A senior manager at the tech company where she worked in a client-facing role. David had found out 2.5 months ago. He hadn't confronted her. Instead, true to who he is, he'd started quietly gathering information. Emails forwarded to himself. Screenshots of transactions on the joint account he'd noticed didn't match anything he recognized. A hotel charge in Whistler for a Tuesday night, when Natalie had said she was at a conference in Toronto. Small things, methodically documented. But it was the financial piece that made me put the coffee down and sit very still. Over the past 14 months, Natalie had been making transfers out of their joint account in amounts carefully calibrated to stay below the threshold that would trigger automatic alerts. $300 here, $800 there, occasionally $1,200 or $1,500. In aggregate, according to David's own calculations in that document, the total was somewhere north of $41,000. The destination account was one David didn't recognize and hadn't been able to fully trace. He'd written in his careful, methodical way, "I think she's been building a separate fund. I don't know yet what it's for. I want to be sure before I do anything." That was the last entry, dated 6 days before the fire. I sat there and thought about the propane fire at a cabin Natalie had never liked, had stopped visiting entirely, had no reason to be at. I thought about my son, alone up in Pemberton on a Thursday night, working on his property the way he always did. I thought about the fact that David had $41,000 missing from his accounts, and a wife with a separate fund he couldn't trace, and a colleague she'd been sleeping with for the better part of a year. And I thought about a phrase I hadn't thought about in a very long time, from the days when I used to consult on insurance compliance for infrastructure projects, beneficiary designation. I called a friend of mine. 40 years I've known him. We met on a job site in Prince George in 1987. He's a retired RCMP officer, now works in private investigations out of Abbotsford. His name is Vincent, and I trust him the way I trust very few people. I told him what I'd found. I told him about the transfers, the folder, the Scottsdale timing. I didn't tell him what I suspected yet, because I wanted to say it out loud to myself first and see if it still sounded rational. It still sounded rational. Vincent said, "Send me what you have. Don't touch anything else. And Harold, don't say anything to her yet." I went back inside and sat beside my son. Natalie arrived at the hospital at 6:30 that evening, 14 hours after David had been admitted. She came in looking composed, carry-on bag over her shoulder, wearing the kind of outfit that looks casual but isn't. She hugged me briefly. That thing she did where it looked like a hug but felt like two people standing near each other, and then she went in to see David. I stood in the doorway and watched her. She stood at his bedside for maybe 4 minutes. She didn't touch him. She looked at him the way you might look at a car that had broken down, with a kind of irritated assessment of the inconvenience. Then she came back out and said, "The doctor said he's stable. That's good." "It is," I said. "I'm going to find a hotel. I can't stay here all night. I'm exhausted from the travel." "Of course," I said. I said very little to her for the next 2 days. I was pleasant. I asked after her comfort. I made sure she felt that I was the same slightly too formal father-in-law I'd always been around her, the one she'd long since written off as not worth managing closely. That was important. Vincent was not idle. On the second day, he called me with things that changed the shape of everything. The account Natalie had been transferring money into was a personal account she'd opened 18 months ago, alone, at a different bank than the one she and David used together. The account had a balance of approximately $44,000, more than David's estimates, because the transfers had continued after his last diary entry. The account also had a second name on it as a joint holder, added 4 months ago. The colleague. Vincent had also pulled something else, quietly, through contacts I won't ask about. Natalie had, 14 months ago, increased the payout on David's life insurance policy. She had done this through his employer's benefits portal, which she'd apparently accessed using his credentials at some point. The beneficiary on the policy had not changed. David had designated her as beneficiary years ago and it hadn't been updated. But the payout amount had been increased to $1.2 million. The premium difference had been coming out of their joint account in small increments. I want you to understand that when Vincent told me this, I was standing outside the hospital on Heather Street in the Vancouver rain, and I had to breathe very carefully for about 30 seconds. My son nearly died in that fire. The propane system at the cabin was one he'd installed himself that summer, and the RCMP had already noted in their initial report that the cause appeared to be a faulty connection that allowed gas to accumulate before ignition. They were treating it as accidental. Nobody had been looking for anything else. I called Vincent back and said, "We need to go to the RCMP." He said, "I know. I've already made a call." "But Harold, the financial evidence is solid. The insurance piece is solid. The fire cause investigation will take time. What we have right now will be enough to start." I said, "How long?" He said, "Give me 48 hours." I went back inside and I sat beside my son. He was more alert that day, still on significant pain medication, drifting in and out. But he looked at me once in a long, clear moment and said, "Dad," just that. And I said, "I'm here. You're going to be fine." And I meant both things completely. What happened in the next 48 hours, I'll compress, because some of it involves processes I don't fully understand, and some of it is still ongoing in ways that prevent me from being specific. Vincent worked with a financial crimes unit contact at the RCMP. The combination of the undisclosed joint account, the incremental transfers, the insurance policy modification using David's credentials without his knowledge, and the timeline relative to the fire gave investigators enough to issue a warrant and begin formal inquiry. There was also something else that came to light, something I hadn't known, and David's file hadn't fully captured. The colleague, the man whose name was on that account with Natalie, had a previous matter in Ontario from 9 years ago, a civil dispute with a former partner involving disputed assets after that person had also been seriously injured in an accident. The case had settled. Nothing criminal had ever been established. But the pattern was enough to make certain people pay very close attention. On the morning of the third day after I'd arrived in Vancouver, I was in the hospital cafeteria with a terrible cup of coffee when my phone rang. It was Vincent. "It's done," he said. Natalie was taken into custody at the hotel she'd been staying at in downtown Vancouver. She was arrested on charges related to financial fraud and breach of trust. The fire investigation was still ongoing, and I've been told it may result in additional charges. I don't know yet. I try not to let myself think too far ahead into that part of it, because when I do, I have to sit with the full weight of what it means, and I can only carry so much at once. What I can tell you is what happened when I went in to see David that afternoon. He was more alert. They'd adjusted his medication downward. He was going to need surgery, skin grafts on both forearms, and a long course of physiotherapy. But the attending physician had told me that morning that, barring complications, he expected David to recover substantially full function. That was the phrase she used, substantially full function. I nearly wept in the hallway when she said it. I sat down next to my son's bed. He looked at me, tired, in pain, confused by the tubes and the bandages and the hospital light, but present. "My son." I didn't know how to start. He said, "Something happened. I can tell from your face." I said, "Yes." He said, "Is it Natalie?" I looked at him for a moment. He already knew something, I think. The way you know when a thing you've been quietly dreading has finally arrived. "Yes," I said. "I need to tell you some things." I told him everything. I didn't soften it or pace it strategically. He was my son, and he was an adult, and he deserved to hear it all from me, directly, in his own father's voice, rather than from a stranger or a news article or a document shoved across a table. He listened without saying anything for a long time. When I finished, the room was quiet except for the machinery and the distant sounds of the ward. He looked at the ceiling. Then he looked at me. He said, "I knew about the affair. I didn't know about the rest." I said, "I know, son. I read your folder." He was quiet again. "Then the fire wasn't an accident, was it?" I said, "We don't know yet, officially." He closed his eyes. I watched him process something enormous in the space behind his eyelids, watched his jaw work, and then something settled in his face. Not peace exactly, something more like a decision to still be here, to still be present in his own life. He said, "Good thing you came." I said, "I'll always come." That's the kind of thing that sounds trite when you write it down, I know. But when your son says that to you from a hospital bed with his arms wrapped in burn dressings and everything he thought his life was in pieces around him, it doesn't sound trite. It sounds like the whole point. David spent 11 weeks recovering. He had 2 surgeries. He's going to have scarring on his forearms that he'll carry the rest of his life, which makes me furious in a way I try to keep quiet, because he doesn't need my fury. He needs my steadiness. His divorce proceedings are being handled by a very good family lawyer in Vancouver, a woman his company's HR director recommended. The joint account was frozen pending the financial investigation. The life insurance policy has been reviewed by the insurer and is the subject of its own separate inquiry. There are lawyers involved that I do not fully understand, and I have stopped trying to. Natalie's criminal case is working its way through the system. I won't comment on its likely outcome. I've learned, at 64 years old, that the legal system moves on its own timetable, and the only thing you destroy by watching it too closely is your own peace of mind. What I will say is this. I've been retired for 3 years. I live alone in Kelowna in a house that's slightly too large for one person. I have a daughter in Edmonton who calls me every Sunday. I have a dog, a big lazy shepherd husky mix named Biscuit, who is somehow 11 years old and shows no signs of slowing down. I have a life that is, honestly, quieter than I'd prefer sometimes. But I drove to Kelowna General 2 months after everything happened, and I donated a substantial check to their burn unit. Not Vancouver General. I'll do that too eventually. But my local hospital, the one that might one day help someone else's son. The nurse at the donor reception desk asked me if there was anyone I'd like the donation to honor for their records. I said, my son David. He's going to be fine. She said, that's lovely. What's the occasion? I thought about it. He's alive, I said. That's the occasion. David came up to Kelowna for 2 weeks in October, once he was cleared to travel. We didn't do much. We drove around the lake. We went to a farmer's market. We watched hockey in the evenings and argued about the Canucks the way we always have. He slept a lot, his body still healing from the inside in ways you can't see. I made too much food. Biscuit adored him, which David thought was funny because the dog has always been selective about people. On his last evening before driving back to Vancouver, we sat on the back deck after dinner with a couple of whiskeys. It was a clear October night, cold enough to need a jacket, the kind of night the Okanagan does very well. The lake was silver in the dark. He said, I think I knew something was wrong for a long time. I just didn't want to look directly at it. I said, most of us don't. He said, the cabin. I keep thinking about the cabin. I worked on that place for 2 years. I love that place. And I keep wondering if that's the thing that should make me angrier. Not the marriage. The cabin. I said, you can feel however you want about it. He said, I'm going to fix it up again. In the spring. New propane system, obviously. But I want to go back. I said, I'll help you. He looked at me and smiled. A real one. The kind that goes back to when he was a kid. You're terrible at carpentry, Dad. I'm aware, I said. I'll be there anyway. He raised his glass. I raised mine. The lake was very still, and my son was alive, and whatever came next, we would figure it out the way we always had. One thing at a time, together, with no more looking away from the things that needed to be seen. There's a particular kind of clarity that comes to you in the worst moments of your life, and I've been thinking about that a lot since everything with David happened. Not the panic. I'm talking about what settles underneath the panic once you stop fighting it. That quiet place where you finally see things as they actually are, not as you wished they were. I spent years being polite about Natalie, talking myself out of things I noticed. That's not wisdom. That's avoidance dressed up as civility. I know the difference now. Real discernment, the kind that actually protects the people you love, requires you to trust what you observe, even when what you observe is uncomfortable. David did that too, in his own methodical way. He built that folder, documented everything, kept his head when his instincts were telling him something was deeply wrong. That discipline, that willingness to look directly at a hard thing rather than turn away, is what gave us something to work with when we needed it most. It's something I want to carry forward. Not paranoia, just honesty with yourself about what you're seeing. What Natalie did, the transfers, the insurance, the timing of all of it, that didn't come from nowhere. Actions like that build over time, small decision by small decision, each one making the next one easier. And the unraveling worked the same way. Vincent pulling one thread, then another. The whole thing came apart because the foundation was rotten from the start. You can't build a life on that kind of calculation and expect it to hold. I'm not saying the universe tidies things up on a schedule. I've lived long enough to know that's not always true, but I do believe that the patterns we build, the choices we repeat, eventually become the architecture we're trapped inside. Hers did. What I'm proud of, and I don't say that lightly because I was raised not to talk about pride, is that I didn't lose myself in it. I was furious. I am still furious, some days, when I let myself sit with what could have happened. But I didn't act from fury. I acted from steadiness. I called Vincent. I read carefully. I stayed present beside my son instead of charging off and making noise. There's a version of me, maybe a younger version, who would have gone straight at her and destroyed any chance of the evidence holding up. I didn't do that. I held it together because David needed me to hold it together. And David, watching him recover, watching him come up to Kelowna in October and sit on that deck and talk about going back to fix the cabin in the spring, that's the thing I'll carry longest. He could have folded. He had every reason to. Instead, he decided to still be here, still be present in his own life, still make plans. That kind of resilience doesn't come from nowhere either. It gets built, slowly, from the small decisions you make over years about who you're going to be when things get hard. I'm 64. I don't have the energy for pretending anymore. Not about people, not about situations, not about what I know in my gut to be true. That's not bitterness. That's just what it looks like when you finally stop being polite to yourself. My son is alive. His forearms will always carry the scars. So will I, in my own way. But we're going back to that cabin in the spring. And this time, we're going together.